Elara's light, in a peaceful valley where rolling hills curved like soft silk ribbons, and a gentle stream murmured year-round. There was a small village named Ravelle. Each morning, the first rays of sunlight would gently brush across the old tiled rooftops, awakening every little corner of the village in a soft golden hue. In this serene setting, Elara grew up like a resilient wildflower, bright, yet quiet. She wasn't known for dazzling beauty, but for her warm gaze and gentle smile that remained, even on rainy days. From a young age, Elara carried a different kind of soul. She didn't just hear the words of people, but also the whispers of grass, the echoes of the wind, and the heartbeat of the earth. She would often sit for hours by the stream, her hand touching the cool water, her eyes following drifting clouds. The elders in the village called her the dreamy child, but deep down, they believed she was something truly special. But life was never a perfect melody. As Elara grew older, she came to understand the cost of being different. When her father suddenly passed away from a severe illness, she and her mother struggled to get by on the meager income from weaving. Despite poverty, Elara maintained her calm, as if guarding a tiny flame in her heart, a fragile belief in goodness. Yet life seemed unwilling to let that flame burn on peacefully. At the age of 19, a sudden flash flood swept away the small house nestled on the hillside, filled with childhood memories, the place where she and her mother once mended torn cloths. Her mother, the last family she had left, did not survive. On a stormy night, Elara lost everything. On the day of her mother's funeral, the entire village of Ravelle was cloaked in deep sorrow. But the one who hurt the most stood silently before the cold. Wet grave Elara, her eyes no longer sparkled like before. They were quiet, like a winter lake still on the surface, yet hiding immense depth. People saw her smile less, speak less. Each morning, instead of greeting the sunrise by the stream, she sat before the ruins of her home, eyes gazing toward the misty hills in the distance. Elara's silence wasn't surrender, it was self-defense. She did not curse life or blame fate. She simply drew inward, like a seed sinking deep into frozen soil, waiting for spring to come. But those around her didn't understand. They whispered that Elara had lost her inner light, that she was only a faded shadow of the girl who once brightened the village. And perhaps Elara started to believe that too. Every night, she sat alone by the window of the temporary room the villagers had built for her, holding an old photo of 3 people, herself, her mother, and her father. The colors had faded over the years, but their faces remained vivid in her heart. Sometimes she would quietly ask, "How do you go on when everything familiar has vanished? How do you live when all that remains is a shadow of who you used to be?" No one had an answer, but the very moment Elara began to ask was also when a small spark of life began to rise again. That was when the flame, thought to be extinguished, quietly began to burn once more in the ashes. On days when the sky was thick with mist and the wind from the valley carried a chill that seeped into the bones, Elara still kept her old habit, walking alone to the stream. It was the only place where she truly felt alive, where the sound of flowing water and the intense scent of wild grass could fill the silent void in her heart. The stream hadn't changed mossy rocks, the same narrow path through reeds. Yet, in that unchanging scene, Elara saw the quiet transformation of her inner world. That day, she sat on her usual stone, resting her head on her knees, eyes quietly following the rippling water under the slanted afternoon light. A gentle breeze suddenly swept through the trees, making the last leaves of the season tremble like silent sobs. The wind carried the scent of jasmine, the fragrance that used to follow her mother whenever she walked past the room. That scent tightened Elara's chest, as if the past had just brushed against her. Nothing clearly happened. No one came. No words of comfort were spoken. But in that fragile moment, Elara felt something deep begin to stir, like a hidden underground spring, quietly beginning to seep through dry earth, like a faint ray of light piercing thick clouds. She couldn't name the feeling, but it wasn't sadness, no longer despair. It was something softer like forgiveness, not for anyone else, but for herself. Elara closed her eyes. In that complete darkness, the faces of her parents appeared not blurry as in the old photo, but clear and warm, as in her most cherished memories. They said nothing. They only looked at her, the way one might gaze at something slowly coming back to life. And that gaze, even if imagined, was enough to make Elara smile gently for the first time in months. She didn't cry. The pain inside her didn't vanish, but it stopped pressing so heavily, like the water beneath her feet still flowing, still carrying fallen leaves and mud. But in that flow, something began to clear. Elara opened her eyes, lifted her gaze to the sky. The late afternoon sunlight slipped through gray clouds, casting a thin beam across the water. It wasn't brilliant, but it was real. And for the first time, after so many days of feeling lost, Elara whispered to herself, "Maybe I can still begin again." It wasn't a promise, nor a declaration, just a small voice rising from the deepest place, within a place once thought forever silent. But from that place, life began to return. Elara stood up, gently brushed the dust from her dress, and looked around the stream as if seeing it for the first time with new eyes. Not the same stream of her memories, but a part of the present that welcomed her this version of herself. Not perfect, not whole, but healing. And from that day on, every afternoon, Elara returned to the stream not to escape, but to speak with herself. The wind still blew, the water still flowed, and her heart, though still bearing wounds, was learning how to heal, like tender grass growing again after a harsh winter, like light, even dim, still able to reveal a way home in the early days of spring, when the sky still bore a hint of winter's gray. But the grass and trees had begun to gently stir. Elara felt a strange stirring from within. It was no longer the call of old memories or worn-out sorrows, but a soft rhythm coming from life itself, something deep inside reminding her that it was time to open up and welcome something new. That morning, as she stepped along the damp earthen path still marked by night's dew, Elara saw a traveler sitting beneath an ancient tree at the edge of the village. The man appeared old, his silver hair tousled lightly by the breeze, his eyes half closed as if listening to something in the earth and sky. He didn't have the weariness of someone who had traveled far, but rather the calm presence of someone familiar with journeys that had no set destination. Elara hadn't planned to stop, but the soft light filtering through the leaves onto his face made her pause. There was something about him, not in his appearance, but in his presence, that reminded her of a feeling she once knew as a child. Listening to her father tell stories on rainy nights, no introductions, no polite questions, just a gentle nod and a shared quiet. And they began to talk. His voice was low, each word carrying the weight of time. He didn't speak of himself, but asked Elara about what she saw on her morning walks. The scent of leaves when still wet, the first sound she heard each day. Somehow, those questions lowered her guard, and for the first time in a long while, she spoke of her pain without needing to defend it. As the sun rose higher and the warmth grew on her shoulders, Elara quietly asked him, "Have you ever lost something?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes opened and looked into hers with a faraway gaze before nodding softly. "I once lost everything, but I learned that no one truly loses it all, as long as they still hold on to something to give to others." Before he left, he handed Elara a small object wrapped in worn cloth. It was a lantern made of wood and frosted glass, simple, aged, and humble. "Don't wait for darkness to fall before you look for light," he said. "Learn to carry it with you, not to banish the night, but to remind yourself that something inside you still burns." That afternoon, Elara brought the lantern home and placed it on the windowsill, where the last rays of daylight often settled. She didn't light it, only sat and stared at it for a long time, as if it held something unnamed within. Inside her, a silence was slowly spreading, not emptiness, but a space where something new might arrive. She realized then, not everyone who enters your life is meant to stay, but some encounters, however brief, can forever alter the path of a soul. From that day on, Elara began to write again, not to speak of grief or loss, but to remember the small, real things, the smell of pine when rain is near, the touch of her fingers on cold bark, the distant laughter of children. These short notes slowly became little bridges reconnecting her to life, not to the past or future, but to the living, breathing moment right in front of her. She kept the lantern close, not carrying it around or displaying it like a treasure, but placing it where it could always be seen. Each time her eyes met it, she remembered the look of the old traveler, the look of someone who had lost, but never fallen, of a soul that had endured the longest nights and still held onto warmth. And from that, Elara learned to keep her own light alive, small, fragile, but unyielding, a light that would never go out. That spring lingered longer than usual, as if time itself wanted to slow down, giving Elara more room to breathe deeply and listen more closely to herself. Gentle morning light slipped through the wooden window frame and rested on her shoulder as she sat quietly writing beneath a soft veil curtain. In her small room, the sound of her pen gliding across paper became a familiar rhythm, like a tender breath. Elara no longer wrote to preserve, nor to explain, but simply to reconnect with the current of life, a place her mind had been severed from during the long captivity of grief. From the rustic wooden lantern the traveler had left behind, Elara began to sense a subtle but persistent urge, an inner drive that wasn't blazing or grand, but flickered gently, like the first spark of a flame after a dark and endless night. She no longer avoided her presence in the world, but began to embrace it as an essential part of healing. Each morning, as she opened her window and breathed in the cool air from the hills, Elara didn't just exist, she lived. She slowly returned to the garden behind her home, a place where her mother had once poured her heart into nurturing life. The dry soil beds and withered flowers did not dishearten her. Instead, she spent every afternoon tending to the land, watering, weeding, touching each aged plant as a way to reconnect with nature's flow. Her hands grew rough and calloused, her nails dark with soil, but her spirit grew lighter than ever. Soon, tender sprouts began to emerge, frail, but unyielding, every leaf, every blooming bud became a clear sign of what Elara was coming to understand. Healing does not arrive through grand acts, but through small, consistent, and sincere repetitions. Each day spent in the garden was also a lesson in tending to her own soul gently, patiently, without force. As the garden began to bloom again, Elara placed a small wooden bench by the fence, where the sunlight cast long shadows each afternoon. There, she would read her old notes, and sometimes add new ones. They were no longer pages soaked in sorrow, but simple observations: a flower blooming early, a strange bird's song on a Monday morning, or the warmth of tea on a lightly rainy day. Children from the village started noticing her more. They no longer avoided her gaze as before, but tiptoed near her garden, now slightly ajar. One brought her ripe apples, another asked for help mending a torn doll. Each small interaction made Elara realize, when we truly reconnect with ourselves, the invisible threads between people also begin to mend. One evening, as the sun sank more slowly than usual, Elara sat alone in the garden, the wooden lantern beside her, unlit. She gazed into the distance, where the horizon shimmered gold. A feeling washed over her, not quite happiness, but a deep sense of presence, a complete being, no longer fighting her brokenness, but learning to embrace it as part of who she was and is becoming. She understood then that the path of healing has no finish line. It's not straight, nor fast, and never the same for anyone. For Elara, it was a journey from the shadows of memory to the light of the present, from isolation to connection, from pain to gratitude. Each step, each breath, each word she wrote was an offering to herself, a tribute to the one who dared to stay, to face it all, and to keep on living, even when life promised nothing. And within those smallest things, Elara discovered something greater than all. She no longer needed to search for light in distant places. That light had long begun to glow from within her quietly, steadily, like the gentle touch of spring upon the world. After a long, dark winter, summer arrived, breathing life into every grain of soil, and the village of Ravelle seemed to don a new coat, warmer, brighter. But the most noticeable change wasn't in the sprouting buds or the chirping birds. It was in Elara's smile, no longer the faint, guarded grin in the shadows, but a soft light radiating from a soul that had healed each fracture. She didn't try to be joyful, she simply lived. And in that honesty, everything around her began to shift. Elara's garden became a familiar resting place for villagers. There were no invitations, no advertisements, yet more and more footsteps found their way there. An old woman came asking for herbs to brew hair rinse. A man brought a broken chair for Elara to mend. And the young girl who once feared her sorrowful gaze now visited often, bringing petals she had found. In the quiet welcome of Elara, each person seemed to rediscover a sense of peace within themselves. She didn't teach, nor offer advice. Elara simply listened fully, without interruption, without judgment, and sometimes that was enough for someone to find themselves again, a widowed woman who hadn't left her house in years. After sitting silently in Elara's garden a few times, began tidying her kitchen and preparing a proper meal. A withdrawn orphaned boy, after Elara taught him how to plant seeds, started sharing them with classmates. The changes came like a gentle breeze, but spread like sunlight filtering through the leaves. Elara realized that the renewal within her wasn't meant to stay confined. It rippled outward into the soil, over rooftops, into the quiet lives surrounding her. And the miracle was, she never tried to make it happen. She just lived truthfully, with a heart that knew how to ache, remember, and forgive. One day, while tending to her lavender patch, Elara noticed a young woman standing at the gate. She said nothing, only looked at Elara with lost eyes. Without a word, Elara gave a slight nod, inviting her in. They sat together for hours in silence. Only the sounds of birds, wind, and two healing hearts filled the space. When the girl left, Elara handed her a sprig of lavender. No words, but in the girl's eyes, a flicker of light had been rekindled. Later, Elara was invited to speak at a small village gathering, not as a healer, but as someone who had once been broken and was still learning to live on. Sitting on the steps of the community hall, she shared pieces of her story, not in order, not embellished, just in a calm voice. When she recounted the time she thought she'd never smile again, silence fell. Then someone began to cry. Another nodded. Applause followed, not all at once, but in waves, like hearts slowly coming back to life together. That afternoon, returning to her garden, Elara placed the wooden lantern on the table and lit it for the first time since receiving it. The soft, warm glow filled the room, lighting up dried flowers, smudged papers, and her reflection in the mirror. She was no longer the Elara of the past, nor the shadow of herself post-loss. She was the Elara of now, a small light in a vast world, yet bright enough to guide someone who was lost. That light didn't only shine outward, it illuminated within. Elara understood then. We don't always need to do great things to make a difference. We just need to live truthfully, love the simple things with persistence, and keep the quiet fire in our hearts gently burning that alone can light a path for those walking through their own night. Elara's journey is not just a story of overcoming pain, but a gentle symphony of life, where every note resonates from the simplest of moments. She did not triumph with noise or splendor, but through quiet resilience, like a small flame that continues to burn through the darkest night. Elara reminds us that healing is not a destination, but the way we choose to live each day, with an open heart, a gentle gaze, and the belief that even from ashes, new life can begin.